everybody. I hope everyone's doing well. I'm going to be reviewing chapter 5 of my book, Whose Life Is It? The Moral Debt for Life Enslavement. Sorry, I'm just waiting for it to come back up. Okay, here it is. Chapter 5 State Control Over Disposal Rights. This disappeared again. Chapter 5 State Control Over Disposal Rights Prove Enslavement. Chapters 1 through 4 have established the legal framework for life slavery. Chapter 1 proved through the disposal rights test that the master state owns your life if you lack autonomous disposal rights over your person, the right to opt out of existence through humane, medically assisted means, that someone else owns you. Every jurisdiction prohibits or heavily restricts this right. The master state owns your life. Chapter 4 identified the original breach as committed by your parents. They imposed existence on you without your consent, creating a moral debt for life enslavement. The forfeiture criterion specifies what parents owe: competent parenting, respect for autonomy, mandatory inheritance, and the right to discharge through unconditional access to a peaceful exit. Parents created you, they are responsible for the cost you bear. Chapter 3 demonstrated how the master state compounds the original breach. The state did not create you, but the state prohibits you from opting out while simultaneously extracting value from your forced continuation. The Supreme Court in Glesberg articulated state interest in forced continuation, interest in maintaining the medical profession's integrity, protecting vulnerable populations, and preventing broader societal harms. These interests operate through the same logic that justified chattel slavery. The master extracts value from the slave's captivity while claiming the arrangement serves the slave's interests. Chapter 4 documented while courts cannot provide relief from life slavery, Stanton Doctrine dismisses challenges before examining whether violations occurred. Summary judgment prevents jury trials. Immunity doctrines, qualified, absolute, prosecutorial, judicial, sovereign, eliminate liability even when violations are proven. The legal profession's monopoly ensures that only those specialized into respecting judicial oppression are allowed to represent clients. Courts serve as gatekeepers who legitimize slavery by creating the appearance of due process while systematically denying remedies. This chapter examines the specific legal mechanisms through which life slavery operates, complete control over disposal rights. Understanding this mechanism is necessary for before examining the perpetual violence the master state deploys to maintain your captivity. Chapter 6 will document the perpetual violence, the actual enforcement mechanism you encounter in your daily life. And before I continue, I just want to see if there's a couple of people here. Democracy presents itself as governance through consent rather than force. You are told that democratic governments derive their authority from the people's will, that voting constitutes meaningful consent to state action, and democracy represents a peaceful, civilized order rather than violence. The truth is that democracy is not nonviolent. Democracy is perpetual violence concealed through claims of majority authorization. Every democratic law operates through violence. Every regulation, every prohibition, every tax is enforced through the threat of violence deployed by armed agents. The difference between democracy and a dictatorship is not the presence or absence of violence. Both deploy violence to compel obedience. The difference is that democracies convince you that the violence is legitimate because you consented through voting, while dictatorships openly admit that obedience is based on force. This chapter examines the mechanism through which democratic violence operates, the state's monopoly on violence, concealed through manufactured legitimacy that transforms naked violence into law. Max Weber provided the clearest definition of the state. A state is a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. This definition contains two critical elements. First, the state monopolizes violence. The state does not merely use violence. The state claims exclusive authority to use violence within its territory. No other entity may legitimately deploy force. If you use violence to prevent someone from taking your property, you commit a crime: assault, battery, false imprisonment. If the state uses violence to take your property for unpaid taxes, the state acts legitimately. The difference is not the violence itself, but who deploys it. Private violence is criminal, the state's violence is legitimate. Second, and this is the critical word, the state claims this monopoly is legitimate. The state does not merely assert the power to use violence. The state asserts that its use of violence is morally justified, that its violence operates through the pretense of proper authority rather than naked force. This claim of legitimacy distinguishes the state from a criminal gang that also monopolizes violence in its territory. Both deploy force to extract resources and compel obedience. But the state insists its violence is legitimate while the gang's violence is not. Weber's definition includes the word legitimate for a reason. If the state merely monopolized violence without claiming legitimacy, people would recognize state action as brute force. They would understand that taxation is theft backed by guns, that regulation is command backed by imprisonment, that interference with disposal rights is enslavement backed by violence. The state's power would rest transparently on force rather than consent. But the state does not want to rule solely by naked force. Ruling through force alone is expensive. It requires constant surveillance, perpetual threat, and immediate violent response to disobedience. The state prefers that you obey voluntarily, that you internalize obedience as a duty rather than as a response to external compulsion. This is where its claim of legitimacy becomes essential. If the state can convince you that its violence is legitimate, that obedience is morally required, that law reflects legitimate authority rather than power, that the state's authority derives from your consent, then you will police yourself. You will obey not because armed agents stand ready to harm you, but because you believe obedience is right. The state invests enormous resources in manufacturing this belief. Every law is violence. This is not a metaphor or exaggeration. It is a literal operational reality of how the law functions. Consider any law. You must pay taxes. If you refuse, the state does not politely accept your refusal. The state sends notices demanding payment. If you continue to refuse, the state seizes your bank accounts. If no bank accounts, if you have no bank accounts, the state seizes your property. If you resist seizure, the state sends armed agents to force compliance physically. If you defend yourself against these armed agents, they will shoot you. The violence is not separate from the law. The violence is the law. The law is simple. The law is simply the formalized description of what the state will do if you disobey. The state enforces this law by throwing you in a cage by force, taking your property through force, or taking your life by force. Robert Cover articulated this reality clearly. Legal interpretation takes place in a field of pain and death. A judge articulates her understanding of a text, and as a result, somebody loses his freedom, his property, his children, and even his life. Law is not an abstract principle. Law is violence waiting to be deployed. Strip away the formal language, the whereas clauses, the legal citations, the procedural requirements, and every law reduces to a simple command: obey or we will use violence against you. The state does not want you to recognize law as violence. The state wants you to understand law as something sacred, something deserving obedience independent of the violence backing it. The state wants you to feel guilt when you violate the law, shame when you are caught, and reverence towards legal institutions. This is not merely legitimacy. This is sacralization, the transformation of law from violence into moral commandment. Legitimate authority commands obedience because people believe that the commanding authority has the right to command. Sacred authority commands obedience because people believe disobedience is morally wrong, independent of consequences. The state does not merely want you to acknowledge its authority. The state wants you to perceive its the state wants you to perceive obedience as a spiritual duty. This is why the state uses religious language and ceremonial trappings around law. Courts resemble temples, formal dress, elevated benches, rituals of standing and sitting, and the command, all rise, when the judge enters. Judges wear robes like priests. Legal proceedings use archaic formal language that sets law apart from ordinary discourse. The entire performance is designed to inspire awe and reverence. The state teaches children to revere law from the earliest age. Elementary schools have students recite the Pledge of Allegiance, a loyalty oath to the state performed as a daily ritual. Students learn that the law is what makes society civilized and that the Constitution is a sacred document and that judges are wise arbiters who interpret law fairly. The programming is comprehensive and begins before children can critically evaluate what they are being taught. The state uses mandatory public education to program obedience. Children spend 12 years or more being conditioned to respect authority, follow rules, ask permission, and accept that institutional structures are necessary and natural. As Michael Falcott documented, this disciplinary training creates subjects who self police, who internalize norms and regulate their own behavior without requiring external force. Antonio Gramsci identified this process as cultural hegemony. The ruling class maintains power not merely through force, but by shaping the cultural beliefs and values that make its rule appear natural and inevitable. The state does not merely use violence. The state shapes consciousness so that people cannot imagine alternatives to state control. Edwin, Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky demonstrated how mass media manufactures consent by limiting the range of acceptable debate, marginalizing dissent, and presenting state actions as necessary responses to threats. The result is a population that believes it is free while accepting comprehensive control as normal and necessary. Once the programming succeeds, you no longer consciously recognize the violence motivating your obedience. You stop at red lights not because you fear police violence, but because you have been trained to associate red lights with stopping. You file tax returns not because you fear being thrown in a cage, but because you have been trained to experience tax filing as a civic duty. You obey occupational licensing requirements not because you fear criminal prosecution, but because you have been trained to believe licenses ensure competence and protect consumers. Every law exists because the state is prepared to deploy violence to compel compliance. Excuse me. The state is prepared to deploy force to compel compliance, but the programming allows you to obey without consciously recognizing the violence motivating your obedience. You internalize the command as a duty. You police yourself. This makes state violence far more effective. The state does not need to deploy force constantly because you obey voluntarily, not because you genuinely consent, but because you have been programmed to experience obedience as natural and proper. There is no legitimacy beyond manufactured perception. The state's authority does not derive from genuine consent, social contract, or moral right. The state's authority derives from two sources. Number one, the capacity to deploy overwhelming violence against anyone who disobeys. And two, the successful programming of the population to believe that this violence is legitimate. Remove the programming, and what remains? Violence. The state commands, and if you disobey, the state uses force against you. That is the operational reality. Everything else, the ceremonies, the formal procedures, the claims of constitutional authority, the invocations of the people, is theater designed to obscure that reality. Weber's definition is accurate. The state claims the monopoly on legitimate violence, but this is a claim, not a fact. The state's violence is no more legitimate than any other violence. The difference is that state violence has the state, excuse me, the difference is that the state has successfully convinced you to accept its violence as legitimate while rejecting other violence as criminal. Once you understand this, you can see clearly. The law is not justice manifest. The law is violence with good public relations. State control over your life operates through three domains: the disposal of the person, the disposal of property, and the disposal of services. And this comes from chapter one. Let me see if there's anybody still here. Okay. Um, this comes from Plessy versus Ferguson. So this I've already explained the source for this. Um, in Eastern Man, the state prohibits an autonomous disposal and forces disposal according to state preferences, exactly as a slave master prohibits an autonomous disposal by slaves and forces disposal according to the master's preferences. The master state has the final say over your person, property, and services. You cannot dispose of any of these without the master state's permission. This is the defining characteristic of life slavery. The master state controls disposal rights while the life slave retains only those privileges the master state permits. The master state controls whether you may continue existing or whether you may exit existence. Chapter 1 documented how every jurisdiction either prohibits assisted death entirely or restricts it through gatekeeping criteria that most people cannot satisfy. Even in jurisdictions with death with dignity statutes, the master state maintains control through requirements that exclude most people, terminal diagnosis with less than 6 months to live, multiple physician approvals, waiting periods, mental competency evaluations, and residence requirements. These restrictions ensure that the master state, not you, decides whether you may exit. Involuntary commitment, the master state claims authority to imprison you without criminal charge if the master state determines you pose a danger to yourself. This determination operates through minimum due process, a psychiatrist's evaluation, a brief hearing, and a judge's signature. You can be confined indefinitely based on stated intentions or assessed risk. Chapter 6 will examine the mechanics of how this operates, the armed seizure, the locked facilities, and the forced medication. If someone provides you with humane means of opting out, they face criminal prosecution. This prohibition ensures that you remain trapped even if you are physically able to end your own life without existence. Chapter 6 will document how the state deploys this violence to isolate you in your captivity. The master state controls whether you may keep your property, how you may use it, and under what circumstances the master state may require its disposal. Property taxes. You do not own property in any meaningful sense. You hold conditional use rights that the master state may revoke at any time. If you stop paying annual tribute, the master state seizes the property. You cannot opt out of this arrangement. True ownership includes disposal rights, the right to keep or transfer the thing owned without ongoing payments to third parties. You lack this right. The master state owns the property. You rent it through taxation. Even if you pay property taxes, the master state still restricts how you may use your own property through zoning laws, building codes, and environmental regulations. You cannot dispose of your property, use it, modify it, transfer it according to your own preferences. You must dispose according to the master state's preferences. The master state controls disposal. This is the defining characteristic of ownership, which I also explained in chapter 1. Eminent domain, the master state may force you to dispose of property when the master state decides that disposal serves public interest. The master state can take your property and give it to a private developer because the developer's project will generate more tax revenue. This power proves conclusively that you do not own property. If you owned it, the master state could not force its transfer. The master state may seize property allegedly connected to criminal activity, even without convicting you of a crime. The burden falls on you to prove the property was not connected to criminal activity, an expensive process most people cannot navigate. Statistics show police departments use asset forfeiture as revenue generation, seizing billions in property annually. Chapter 6 will document how this operates as naked theft under color of law. And finally, we have the disposal of services. The master state controls whether you may earn a livelihood, what portion of your earnings you may keep, and when the state may command your labor. Individual taxation. The state forces you to dispose of the product of your labor according to the master state's preferences. You work, you generate value, the master state extracts 20 to 40% of that value through taxation. This is the forced disposal of the product of your labor. You did not consent to work for the master state, but the master state commands you transfer the value you created. And if you refuse, the master state will throw you in a cage. Federal law makes willful failure to pay taxes a federal crime punishable by up to 5 years imprisonment. Occupational licenses. The master state controls your ability to earn a livelihood. Nearly one-third of American workers require state-issued licenses to work legally. These are not certifications of competence but permissions. State grants of authority to perform work the master state otherwise prohibits. If you attempt to earn a livelihood without a license, you commit a crime. The master state may throw you in a cage. The crime is not causing harm. The crime is earning a livelihood without the master state's authorization. Chapter 6 will examine how this operates as economic violence, forcing starvation or submission. Conscription. In times of war or national emergency, the master state may conscript you into military service. The Selective Service Act requires all males 18 to 25 to register. Failure to register is a federal crime punishable by up to 5 years imprisonment and up to 250,000 in fines. If conscripted, you must serve. Refusal is a crime. This is involuntary servitude, forced labor under threat of violence, jury duty. The master state forces you to perform labor without just compensation. Without just compensation through mandatory jury service. If you are commanded to appear at court, failure to appear results in contempt charges, imprisonment, and fines. Jury service pays $15 to $40 per day, far below minimum wage. The Supreme Court held in Butler versus Perry that compulsory labor does not constitute involuntary servitude because such labor is a civic duty. The court reaffirmed this exception in United States versus Kosminski, holding that forced labor is not involuntary servitude if it is a traditional civic obligation. This creates an enormous exception to the 13th Amendment. Any forced labor the state labels a civic duty escapes constitutional scrutiny. Chapter 6 will examine jury duty in detail as an example of forced labor disguised through legal fiction. In Plessy, the Supreme Court defined slavery. Slavery implies involuntary servitude, a state of bondage, the ownership of mankind as chattel, or at least the control of the labor and services of one man for the benefit of another, and the absence of a legal right to the disposal of his own person, property, and services. State control over disposal rights satisfies this definition, the control of the labor and services of one man for the benefit of another. Income taxation forces you to transfer 20 to 40% of your labor's proceeds to the master state. Occupational licenses prohibit you from disposing of your services without the master state's permission. Jury and conscription forces you to provide labor for the master state's benefit. The master state controls your labor and services for the benefit of the collective, extracting value continuously while prohibiting you from refusing to provide it. The absence of a legal right to the disposal of his own person, property, and services. You lack the legal right to dispose of your person. The master state prohibits you from ending your existence and will confine you if you attempt it. You lack the legal right to dispose of your property. The master state forces disposal through property taxes, may seize property through eminent domain, and may confiscate property through asset forfeiture. You lack the legal right to dispose of your services. The master state prohibits earning a livelihood in many vocations without permission, forces transfer of your labor's proceeds through taxation, and compels labor through jury service and conscription. The master state interferes with your disposal rights across all three domains: person, property, and services. This comprehensive interference, the prohibition on autonomous disposal, combined with forced disposal according to the master state's preferences, creates total enslavement. You possess no autonomous disposal rights in any domain. The master state controls the disposal of your person. You cannot exit your property, forced transfer through taxation and seizure, and your services, prohibited from earning a livelihood without permission, forced labor through conscription and jury duty. This total deprivation of disposal rights satisfies the Plessy definition of slavery precisely. The nature of the relationship. The relationship between you and the master state is not governance, it is enslavement. Governance implies authority derived from consent, that you agree to be governed in exchange for protection and services. But you never consented to this arrangement. You were born into it. You cannot exit through peaceful means. The master state prohibits you from leaving and will use violence to prevent your departure. Enslavement is the correct terminology. The master state owns you in the functional sense that matters. The master state controls whether you may continue existing, controls the disposal of your property you nominally own, and control whether you may earn a livelihood. You lack autonomous disposal rights. The master state has the final say in every domain. The state is not your representative. The state is your master. You are not a citizen, you are property. The rhetoric of democracy obscures this reality, but it does not change it. Chapter 5 has demonstrated how the master state controls disposal rights. Excuse me. Chapter 5 has demonstrated how state control over disposal rights operates as the legal mechanism of life slavery. The master state monopolizes violence, manufactures perception of legitimacy, and uses this manufactured legitimacy to compel obedience without deploying force constantly. The master state controls the disposal of your person, property, and services across all domains exactly as a slave master controls a slave's disposal rights. But legal prohibition alone cannot maintain captivity. The master state must deploy perpetual violence to enforce it. Chapter 6 documents this violence in your everyday life. The involuntary commitment that imprisons you for thought crimes, the property seizures that extract tribute, the occupation licensing that forces starvation if you work without permission, the traffic citations that extract wealth while you travel to compelled labor, the compulsory jury service that compels unenumerated work. Understanding how the legal mechanism functions prepares you to recognize the perpetual violence that maintains your captivity. All right, y'all. So that's the end of chapter 5. I will do that. I guess I'll try to do that next week. So that was a short chapter compared to the other ones. I think from from here on out, I think the chapters are relatively short compared to chapters 1 through 4. So um, be sure to leave some comments and let me know what you think. And I will be back to